Barbara Watson Andaya was born in Sydney, Australia, to an academic father, a University of Sydney professor of plant genetics, and a microbiologist mother who worked at Sydney Hospital. Barbara completed her BA and Diploma of Education in History and English at the University of Sydney and taught social studies at the high school level for a few years. A change in the New South Wales social studies high school curriculum to include a section on our neighbors to the near north prompted Barbara to pursue an MA in Southeast Asian history at University of Hawaii at Manoa through the East-West Center. She intended to gain knowledge so that she could write inexpensive, accessible textbooks for her students in Sydney. That same East-West Center funding paved her way to Cornell University, however, for a summer and fall visit, which ended up extending through the entire academic year. Although Barbara initially planned to return to Australia to write textbooks and even considered applying for a teaching position in Baffin Island, Canada, Barbara so impressed the Cornell faculty that they offered her a full scholarship for a PhD in history. She now teaches in the Asian Studies program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, USA, and she's also taught previously at other universities that they'll discuss. She is the recipient of many awards, from a University Teaching Award and an NEH Fellowship to, among others, a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, which produced a book entitled The Flaming Womb, Repositioning Women in Southeast Asian History, which was a twice academic book of the year. She served as president for the Association for Asian Studies from 2005-6, and the Tan Chin Tuan Professor in Malay Studies at the National University of Singapore from 2011 to 2012, when Leonard was also the same commissioner. Her specific area of expertise is the Western Malay Indonesian archipelago, on which she has published widely, but she maintains an active teaching and research interest across all of Southeast Asia. Professor Andaya Barbara directed the UHM Center for Southeast Asian Studies from 2000 to 2006. As an indication of her scholarship, I counted out no fewer than 34 publications that she's published since 2014, including co-authoring History of Early Modern Southeast Asia, 1400 to 1830, that the other Andaya I'm about to introduce. She's currently the general editor of the new Cambridge History of Southeast Asia. Leonard Andaya was born in Maui to Ilocano-speaking immigrant parents. He knows that I've been snooping about his past. His early involvement in Filipino events at the high school level drew him to Southeast Asia, and he completed his bachelor's degree at Yale University under Professor Harry Benda. Although Leonard's initial plans turned toward employment and government affairs, he ultimately found Dr. Benda so inspiring that he decided to pursue Southeast Asian studies as a career. After graduating from Yale, Leonard went to the Netherlands on a Fulbright, which introduced him to the Netherlands East Indies. He then completed his MA and PhD degrees under Professor O.W. Walters at Cornell University. He's held positions at the University of Malaya, the Australian National University, the University of Auckland, and the University of Hawaii at Manoa since 1993. He was the Tan Chin Tuan Professor in Malay Studies at National University of Singapore in 2011, 2012. Yes, you heard that about Barbara too. And the inaugural Yusuf Ishak Professorship in the Social Sciences in 2017 to 18. Professor Leonard Andaya also directed the UHM Center for Southeast Asian Studies from 1991 to 1997, and currently teaches in the UHM history program. Some of his most recent books are Leaves of the Same Tree, Trade and Ethnicity in the Straits of Malacca, with Barbara Watson Andaya, History of Early Modern Southeast Asia, and they collectively produced the revised third edition of the History of Malaysia. We're all working with Barbara as our boss on the Cambridge New History of Southeast Asia, so Leonard has volume 2. When Barbara and Leonard met as Cornell graduate students, they shared the same advisor, the renowned O.W. Walters, at least according to Leonard's conversation with Catherine Anderson Willen and Ariel C. Lopez. But it was not simply love at first sight, evidently. They both enrolled in a summer class taught by Ruth McVeigh on the politics of Southeast Asia, and they both received A grades on their essays, in which they'd taken opposite positions from each other. Professor McVeigh advised them to compare essays with one another, which evidently they did, since they then decided to become life partners in their personal and professional careers. The Southeast Asian history power duo has written extensively on the early modern history of Southeast Asia, particularly on Indonesia and Malaysia, but on the entire region, for many decades. They have mentored dozens of students from Southeast Asia and the West at multiple institutions, and they have presented their work at more venues globally than I can recount today. As just one recent example, UC Santa Cruz featured both the Andayas in their Southeast Asia Coast Muse Mentors program in January 2023 as part of their Lutz Foundation funded Ocean Pulse series for a day-long slow seminar on Leonard and Barbara Andaya's works. Their family of children and grandchildren is another one of their deliverables, one of their, at least one anthropologist, and if I'm up to date here, several baseball players. They also have countless friends. What makes Barbara and Leonard Andaya so remarkable, however, is not simply their unsurpassed scholarly records, their academic contributions, and their unflinching commitment to getting Southeast Asian history right, even when that requires dense disagreement with colleagues in print. It's their boundless passion for life, for connections, and for knowledge that has enriched all of us who have had the honor to work alongside them. Please join me in welcoming Barbara and Leonard Andaya to discuss 50 years as historians of Southeast Asia, personal perspective.
Thank you so much. That was quite an embarrassing introduction. But Wayne and I agreed to give this talk. We thought it would be something perhaps more than the yoga room. But thank you all for coming. But I also want to express my great thanks to Miriam as the director of the Southeast Asian Studies, to Terry Spillman, who's the associate director, and to all the wonderful graduate students who provide such a fantastic support team. So Lynn and I have been, you might say, kind of fighting since 1967. And so we've shared so many endeavors. So we're starting off this one today as a shared time with you. And what we really wanted to do is to give some sense of where we came from and the kind of changes we see in Southeast Asian studies. So from my perspective, when I look back over 50 years, I feel actually that my career as historian has actually been partly my choice. It's been because of changing circumstances, the concerns in the world itself, and of course, some unexpected good fortune along the way. The award of an East-West Centre grant, which Miriam mentioned, completely changed the direction of my life, completely. And I will always be grateful for that opportunity. I owe the centre a great deal, and I know Leonard feels the same about the Fulbright grant that took him to the Netherlands in 1965. But when I registered in fall 1966 as a graduate student in the history department at the University of Hawaii, Southeast Asia, as such, as a field of study, was only really beginning to emerge as a focus of student interest. At that time, of course, only a handful of you will remember, but around 184,000 military personnel were deployed in Vietnam. And in my incoming class, over in, not in Sakamaki then, but in my incoming class, 150 students signed up to the 2-semester course on Southeast Asian history. Although our professors, Paul Devella and Robert Van Leer, warned us all that we weren't getting to Vietnam until the spring. So that first semester introduced me to the term words like Sukhothai, Pagan, even Srivijaya, and even Angkor, I'm ashamed to say. Well, how did I get there? Well, as a teacher, Mary mentioned that in a high school, I'd been charged in 1964, I guess, with teaching 14-year-old migrants, mostly from Turkey, but a handful quite a lot from Greece and Italy, who had not come to Southeast Asia, to Australia to learn about our neighbours to the near north. But that's what they had to learn in social studies. And as Miriam said, I applied for a grant to write textbooks. There were no textbooks. The ones I planned were going to be 2 shillings each. So that didn't matter if the kids lost them. But when I came to University of Hawaii, when I registered then, the history of Southeast Asia was actually quite new. It was only introduced to the history department here in 1962. And even Professor Walter Bella had been appointed in 1962 also, and then in 65 he was joined by Professor Robert Van Neal, whose field was colonial Indonesia. So we had Thai specialists and Indonesian specialists. But I don't remember any big fanfare. Nobody got up and threw balloons in the air when the Association of Southeast Asian Nations was formed with just 5 members in 1967. And indeed, at that time, there was very little focus on the region as a whole. I think it's worth remembering that although Cornell had established a Southeast Asian Studies program quite early on, their primary interest remained Indonesia that time. And even in my textbook, I took this out, this is from 1966, and I can see little pathetic notes to the side as I was trying to remember when Harlow was founded. but this is the second edition of the history of divided medieval. Only in this one did he include the Philippines was not included. So that was published just 2 years before I entered graduate school. So you can see the field was quite developing at that stage. And I was very fortunate, as Miriam said, because in 1967, the East West Centre, which had more money than it has now, I believe, was made it possible for me to spend a summer and a semester, 2 semesters at Cornell. And as Leonard and I met, as Miriam said, in Elizabeth Day's class, but I always wondered what would have happened if I'd got a B class. But I was also fortunate at that time because Professor Walters was on leave, and his place was taken by G.G. Paul, the author of this book. And bless his heart, D.G. Paul and I got along. And he was instrumental in organising a PhD for scholars, which I never thought of, a PhD fellowship for me to continue at Cornell. And I'll always be grateful to him for that opportunity, that unexpected and very kind opportunity, which enabled me to come back to Cornell after I'd finished my MA here as a PhD candidate. So in short, my engagement with the region had begun here in Hawaii, but it really took off, I could say, it intensified at Cornell because of the unique in the academic environment in which Leonard and I were now situated, the community of students and scholars, and also the global focus on Southeast Asia. Because now, again, not many of you will remember the domino theory, but at that time the world was wedded to the idea that if Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia would become communist. And it goes without saying that when I came to Cornell in the spring of '69, what was uppermost in the students' minds was the war, because our undergraduates were being conscripted. The lottery was introduced in 1969, and remember the straight all people waiting to see if their numbers were going. It was a very tense time, but it was also an exciting time because there were marches, there were demonstrations, there was involvement, there was so much going on. And in the Southeast Asia program, of course, we were thinking about the Vietnam War, of course, but there are lots of other things. The rise of the military in Indonesia and in Myanmar as well, the separation of Singapore and Malaysia, the 1960 riots in Malaysia as well, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. It was very natural indeed at that time that the focus of those who were studying Southeast Asia was less on the region. We weren't really trying to see some cohesion, but more on the individual experiences of these countries as they were battered to make their state as a nation. And so history, I was a history student, obviously. So history at that time was important. History was invoked as an important tool And in 1965, the Indonesian scholar Sucipto said, history instruction is an important means of training good citizens and developing love and loyalty for one's own country. And what was needed now, it was felt, not only among us, but among our colleagues in Southeast Asia as well, was an emphasis on successful struggles, especially against colonialism, of course, of the movement towards independence, and on the tenacity and leadership that was providing the basis for nationhood. And against this background, I sometimes thought that I should apologize for my own PhD thesis, which was a study of the Malay state of Perak in the 18th century, a state that maintained its independence from its aggressive neighbours by establishing a long-term alliance with the Dutch. That was not a very popular message at that time. But the research focused on specific countries in Southeast Asia rather than on regionality has been remarkably resilient, in part because, especially those outside the region, invest so much in learning languages and time spent in the country itself. So the diversity of Southeast Asia, which we so proudly claim, has actually in many ways been made it difficult to follow the maxim of O.W. Waters, who said that comparative studies is the only ultimate justification for area studies. And in Leonard and I have, in our careers, followed colleagues like Anthony Reid and Vic Lieberman, and have tried, in a sense, to be missionary for regionalism, comparative work, even though the concept of a Southeast Asia region has come under very sharp attack from those who see Southeast Asia as a Western and post-colonial construction, or perhaps more kindly, simply a reflection of academic apathy about what to do with that area between China and India. I would have thought that the division of the world into what we must accept as world areas by the 23rd century would have made a difference, that we wouldn't have inflowing about the coherence of the region or the existence of the region. But even so, one still encounters people expressing reservations like the region we call Southeast Asia. So I don't want to belabor the point, but the thinking regionally remains very hard. So a book may have Southeast Asia on its cover, but when you open and look at the chapters, there are individual chapters for each of the Southeast Asian countries. So I have to admit, and so I see some of my students here, and so I'm admitting to you that I too find it hard to develop a coherent overview, and to break away from country considerations to consider the similarities in regions across the whole area that we do call Southeast Asia. So as graduate students in the 1960s, Leonard and I were very much aware of other concerns, including accusations that our field was too Eurocentric, that's a big one at the time. And following the seminal articles by John Smale in 1961 and Harry Bender in 1962, we and our generation were committed to dispelling the notion that we viewed Southeast Asia, in the words of the young Dutch historian Jacob van Leur, from the deck of a ship or the ramparts of a European fortress. Our generation was determined to write histories that put local societies at the forefront. And at Cornell, O.W. Waters encouraged us to focus on targeted studies in order to understand how events were viewed from a local perspective. And this focus on how the world was seen from different vantage points, he believed, would provide the building blocks on which later on you would build generalizations. But the heady days of the 1960s didn't last. In 1975, again, not all of you will remember, but the 1975, the war in Vietnam ended, and in consequence, student interest in Southeast Asia began to decline. Area studies as a whole was dealt a body blow with the publication, the fallout from Edward Said's 1978 book Orientalism, with its trenchant critique of area studies specialists as Orientalists. The idea that area studies was intrinsically useful was increasingly questioned and still resonates, that this resonated among funding thinkers. It became ever more evident that if you were making a grant application or looking for a job, your application would be strengthened by addressing questions that were applicable beyond Southeast Asia. So historians have always been at the forefront of arguing for regional approaches to Southeast Asia and its coherence as a region, but they've always been challenged by the difficulties of generalization. And so now, with the rise of global history, they face a new challenge, trying to insert Southeast Asia, and even when questioned, into the larger field of world history, a field which had been initiated in the 1970s. And the 1980s and 1990s posed new and more unsettling questions, because even while ASEAN was trying to promote regionalism, from our perspective in the United States and the Western world, it was disturbingly evident that academic work in South America was still dominated by individuals from outside the region. Southeast Asians were and still are very much aware of this, and I can think of a number of books edited by Southeast Asians, Abdullah, Abu Talib Ahmad, and Gobeng Lam, I was thinking of, and others as well, who seek to bring Southeast Asian voices into conversation. And you can think of any number of books that, despite the difficulties of access to sources, which are very often in Europe, historians of the Southeast Asia have produced some remarkable and long-lasting books. Nevertheless, in 2002, Ariel Carianto could still ask, can there be Southeast Asians in Southeast Asian studies? And the comparison with South Asia or East Asia is particularly telling, and ever more so in regard to the discipline of history. There have been efforts to train historians, the Leiden project, the Tamak project, is particularly memorable. But nonetheless, Vietnamese still wrote on Vietnam, Filipinos still wrote on the Philippines, Indonesia still wrote about Philippines. The generalization seemed an impossibility. So in this regard, I like, in my final comments, to turn to my ongoing interest in social history, and particularly women's history and gender relationships. Of course, when I entered graduate school, there was no such thing as women's studies or gender studies. But as Bob Dylan sang in 1964, the times they are changing. And the 1960s did see the emergence of the civil rights movement, black rights activism, and most memorably, the energy of women's liberation. In 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which is a landmark in women's studies, and 3 years later, the same year that I entered graduate school, she co-founded the National Organization of Women. I remember a colleague said to me once, well, I said to a colleague once, sorry, what do we need a national organization for women? Little did I know. But throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the influence of the women's movement generated a range of really powerful books and articles, especially in history, such as Joan Kelly's really pathbreaking article, Did Women Have a Renaissance?, which was published in 1977. And the pace of despite these efforts, the pace of incorporation of gender and women's studies into history, into academics generally, was very slow. In 1970 to to give them their due. Cornell was the first Ivy League university to establish a women's studies program, but it didn't become an undergraduate major until 1992. Initially, I didn't have any interest in this field at all. For myself, my life hadn't really been determined by gender, except that becoming a high school teacher, because my father said it's a good job for a woman. But as a graduate student, I did encounter reservations about the advisability of offering financial support to a female student. And when Leonard and I were married in June of 1969, there I faced a continuing feeling that my academic career would have a short life. In other words, my own experiences helped me think more about women in the past. And resulted in the book that Mary mentioned, The Flaming Room. Jim Scott said, rather lurid type. But I can explain the origin. But what bothered me, why I wrote it actually, was because I could see this rise of studies on contemporary 20th century women's studies. But it was like a mushroom, a lot of stuff on the top of a very, very thin stalk. But you can't know what you're changing from unless you do some research towards the distant past, more distant past. And so to give him his due too, even in 1961, Harry Bender, Harry Bender commented on the fact that the social status of women should be investigated. So he saw something. I think Ruth McVeigh too in 1998 in the Frank Bolle lecture at Cornell said, why don't we look at the environment? So people had some perceptions, but what I was trying to do was to provide some case studies and some of the background that Professor Walters said should precede generalization. You need to have case studies. And so it was just at that time that global history really began to take off. And the historians of global history suddenly discovered the early modern period in Southeast Asia. They suddenly found that this part of the world was very important in providing the linkages that underpin the idea of a global experience. And so coming together, when I thought about the distant past of women in this early modern period, as so many new influences started coming into the region, how did they negotiate then? And what was the effect? I thought, well, that's a global conversation. The position of women is something that affects everybody, wherever they are. So it's now more than a generation of scholarship that's significantly nuanced the old generalization that women in Southeast Asia have high status. We don't use that phrase anymore because it's very debatable. But well, now we really prefer phrases such as relatively favorable. But it's still difficult in this region of great diversity to think laterally and comparatively. And nonetheless, I really believe the effort is worthwhile. And I welcome the expansion of women's studies, women's history into gender more generally, because this itself is a reflection of the contemporary interest in the many ways in which gender and sexuality can be expressed. And I should add, it's not simply an interest of the moment, because gender and sexuality is one of the primary keys in human experience. And I'd like to end just by making a few comments about my own discipline, history. The declining support for the humanities in the United States is a matter of record. And the statistics of student enrollment and fewer university positions are disturbing. The dominance of presentism is understandable, but it has resulted in relegating history to a minor position Even though I notice great interest in archaeology, I think it's because people go out and do things and different circles. But history matters, not least to those whose past is under discussion. That is, the people of Southeast Asia themselves. And I believe that for Southeast Asian societies, the study of the past must remain not merely an indispensable aid to understanding the often deep roots of contemporary issues, but a value in its own right. It is thus encouraging to see that most universities in the region do have departments of Southeast Asian studies, and that history is alive and well. And it's in the region, more than anywhere else, that the study of Southeast Asia will be fostered and will always be relevant. New preoccupations, climate change, for example, AI, will help drive the histories of the future, serving as a reminder that our understanding of the past reflects our experience of the present. But also that these experiences will themselves change in ways that we may not foresee. Thank you very much.
So Barbara has covered a whole lot of issues that we both feel very strongly about. And so what I thought I'd do in the second part, we've talked it over as we usually do when we work on a project, was to try to see what else happened in our lives as scholars in Southeast Asia, that made a difference in the way that we proceeded and have written our various histories. And so what I'd like to do now is to turn to another aspect of our careers, which was the very important travels that we've had and the contacts that we've had in different parts of the world. And I think it was this that really structured the way we thought about the region, but also it's helped us to see that perhaps in the future, as Barbara just ended with this idea, that probably it is in the region itself that the saving grace will be for history as a very important subject in Southeast Asia. So what I'd like to do now is to add a few comments about my own background, which differs from Barbara's. As Miriam has said, I was born on Maui, and I think I was one among the very original groups that were involved in the Pacific Asian Affairs Council. I was a high school student. I remember that occurring, and that I had contact already with the region, mainly because of my background. My parents are Filipino migrants. I was born in Hawaii, but being a son of migrants in the period that I grew up, meant that I wanted to be very much like the rest of the Americans, right? I wanted to be an American, basically. So yes, I could understand Ilocano when it's spoken about food. I could follow that very well. And I could also help my dad when he trained the fighting cocks. So I used to go there. So I knew all these words. I knew how to train cocks and so forth. But other than that, I didn't know the language very much. However, I was very aware of the region. And so when I started the study of Southeast Asia, it wasn't something new to me. But the study of Southeast Asia as a region, as an area that you really study in depth, only came when I was a student at Yale. And this was when I studied with Harry Benda. And he is a very well-known scholar in the field. And when I took his course at Yale as an undergraduate, his classes were like at the University of Hawaii, they were full because many people wanted to know about Vietnam. And what I found so fascinating about the way he dealt with Vietnam was the fact that he was very much influenced by his Yale colleague Paul Moose. And Paul Moose really spoke to the class about what Vietnam was. It was not a pawn in the Cold War. Vietnam had its own aspirations. Their people had different needs and didn't want to be a pawn in the Cold War. And I think the kind of lectures that Bender gave brought this home to the undergraduates. So while everybody was waiting for more on Vietnam, they were led into the study of Vietnam in a very positive way. And so my undergraduate experience helped me to kind of prepare for what I then intended to do. It was because of Harry Benda that I decided to focus on Indonesia. This was Harry Benda's field of interest in Indonesia. And so I studied Dutch and I studied Indonesian at Yale in preparation for studying Indonesia. And it was just fortuitous that the teacher, my Dutch teacher, enabled me to live with a family when I got a Fulbright to go to the Netherlands to study in Holland. She got me into a family, which was a very unusual family. It was the father was from Groningen, the northern province of Holland. He was a former civil servant in the Dutch civil service. And he was married to what we call then Indo, a woman who was Dutch Japanese. And so her family, when I lived with them in Holland, I got two completely different views of Indonesia from the kind of things that I had been reading in the books. Meneer Koerts, who was the father, was very much in love with Indonesians. He was an adat controller. He was the official in charge of customary law in South Sulawesi. And he loved the people. They couldn't believe that the Dutch could do such horrible things, which he learned subsequently when he returned to Holland. And for him, his love for the people was so great that when he visited me while I was doing research in the area, many of the people still remembered him and came to pay their respects to him because they remembered him as a very good man. But the other important factor was the Indo community. Because what I realized was that the Indo community was again different from the Indonesian community. Their lives were completely different, yet they were always below the Dutch, and they always knew that. They always felt this as Indos. And then the servant, they had a servant who followed them to Holland after they left Indonesia in 1950. And she was an orphan, and she served as a babu, someone who worked in the house, and so on and so on. And she had another perspective. And so it was a very good experience for me, because I realized then that the community that was studying in books was very different on the ground, and that one had to really go deeply in order to understand how things work. And so this was one of the important things. And the final thing I wanted to mention about that period was when I left the family and I finished my time as a Fulbright student, the man of the house, Meneer Koerts, gave me a Dutch Bhutanese dictionary. It was a 19th century Dutch Bhutanese dictionary with Bhutanese characters and 19th century Dutch. I mean, it was a rarity. But he gave it to me because he said, I want you to study the people that I love, which was the Bugis people in Sulawesi. And so with that dictionary, I intended then to study Bugis history, but of course, it had to wait, maybe because after my time in Holland, I accepted a grant to study at Cornell University with O.W. Walters. One of the reasons he was attracted to me was mainly because I could read Dutch. And Walters at the time was fascinated by the Dutch. He could himself, he could read Dutch very, very slowly. But he just believed that there was so much to learn from the Dutch. And so he wanted someone who could actually read that. And so that was my first contact with O.W. Walters. But as Barbara had mentioned, his interest was really in the region. And so what he wanted me to do was to put everything aside, don't even look at South Sulawesi, but focus on the region. And because of his own interest in Malaysia, I became interested in writing a history of one of the major kingdoms at that time, which is Johor. And at that stage, of course, it was not something that people thought was unimportant. Johor was an important kingdom in Johor, in Malaysia, and it was then really, it became our ticket to our employment after this. So after I completed my PhD, it was published at Oxford University Press at Kuala Lumpur. I was offered a job at the University of Malaya. And so this was when I was able then to shift gears, go to the University of Malaya and work in the Malay, in a Malay university. And it was an exciting time. This is why I'm saying these travels did make a difference about how we thought about the region. Because when I started to teach at the University of Malaya, it was in 1972. It was only 3 years after the May 13th, 1969 incident, which had caused a lot of violence in the major cities primarily in Kuala Lumpur. And so it was only 3 years after this that we had come to the region. And what is interesting was that it was an acknowledgement when we arrived that the British attempt to create a society based on ethnic communities doing what they needed to do in a British constructed type of society had failed. And so what the Malays were doing now that they were in power was to begin the process of making the country more of a Malay country. And so what we had was, for the first time, the influx of students from the east coast of the Malay Peninsula. And they were Malay speakers, and this was something different because entering into the University of Malaya was an English-speaking institution. And this was a major change when we arrived there. And so, because I am Heather Sutherland, somebody you know, Heather Sutherland from Australia, she had studied at Yale and she finished as well. She and I were the first appointees, but because they couldn't find any Malaysians who would teach in Malay, because they said, yes, I can speak Malay, but not formal Malay. And so we're forced to teach in Bahasa Melayu, which was really Bahasa Indonesia. It was Indonesian time. So we used Indonesian to work with these students, but they were wonderful students. And what it made us realize was that there was a great amount of very interested students out there in the provinces who had never had the opportunity to study about their own country in their own language. And so this was a revelation to me. And this has always been to my benefit. Whenever we go back to Malaysia, all of my former students, now most of them are retired, but most of them held very high positions in the government, so we're always treated extremely well. So that was one of the major benefits of that. And so after Malaysia, we were there for 2 years, and we really had a tremendous time moving around with the Malays, visiting people in the kampongs and so forth in the villages. But in 1974, we were offered positions at the Australian National University. So this was when Anthony Reid was the head of the section on Southeast Asia, and Wang Gungwu, Professor Wang Gungwu, was the head of the school. And so it was these two then who took an interest in us, mainly because both had been at the University of Malaya. And so they brought us in. And then until 1978, Barbara and I just shared one job. We never had two jobs. And so we shared one job and we worked at the university. And at that time at the Australian National University, one of the things that was wonderful was their research fellowships. So they gave me a year to do research while Barbara went back to Cornell. And it was then that I finally began the project that I was interested in from the very beginning, which was the history of South Sulawesi. And so it was then that I traveled to South Sulawesi. I lived there for a year with it was a mixed Bugis Makassarese family. And it was living with them that made me realize what was actually happening with this growth of Indonesian nationalism in Sulawesi or in the country. Mainly because she was Bugis, he was Makassarese, but they told their children they had to speak Indonesian, because only with Indonesian they would progress and they would become part of the modern Indonesia. So this was an eye-opener to me. All of a sudden, I thought, these people would be as proud as I was in being able to look and see the Buddhist manuscripts and look at, but nobody could read the Buddhist manuscripts. It was something that I could do because I studied with a very old scholar who subsequently died, but it was the kind of thing where this was already passé. They were interested in the new Indonesia. And so you found that everywhere. If you have a middle-class family, their children all spoke Indonesian. They could use Bugis and Makassarese in the marketplace, but their interest was in the Indonesian. So here again, having been there and having seen what interested the people, made me realize again that the people in these countries in Southeast Asia were interested in their national identity, who they were, their history. This was important to them. Many of the things that we're concerned about when we're graduate students, this was really quite minor compared to the really urgent message, which was to create a sense of being Indonesian. And so we were there, I was there for a year. And one of the things that I did while I was there was to travel through South Sulawesi, because South Sulawesi comprises a large number of different provinces with their own individual histories. So that while we talk about South Sulawesi, those are individual kingdoms. And that everywhere I went while I was studying the 17th century, I realized that I couldn't just read the Dutch archives. The Dutch archives would explain this, but you couldn't understand it unless you went there and looked at the landscape itself. And this is when I realized that when I have students working with me, they will have to do field work. And so some of my students here, I asked them to go in the field to do that field work, because it's only when you're there you realize the value of what you're looking at. And this is one of the reasons why I go to a place and I study the landscape, mainly because the way that the water moves within the ocean might make a difference between your ability to cross over a mile away or to take a roundabout way to get to that place. Or it makes a difference in understanding why this group never worked together with another group, despite the fact that they were neighbors. So you get a very real sense of the differences when you do field work. And so I think this was part of the kind of study that made me realize later on that if I wanted to really do proper research on Southeast Asia, I've got to do that type of assessment of the landscape as well as the waterscape in order to understand how things work. So after I returned from my research and I wrote my book on South Sulawesi, we were out of the job. Basically, the fellowship at the Australian National University ended. We had nothing. So while Barbara was cooking rice, still eat rice, right? While Barbara was cooking rice, she filled out an application to go to the University of Auckland on a postdoc. And she got it. And so we went. So she became a postdoc and I became a house dad. We had a child by then, so I stayed home, watched the child, and so on, so on, did all the things that I needed to do. And then eventually they gave me a job as well. So Auckland then was the first time in 1978, the first time we actually had 2 jobs. Prior to that time, we always had to share. And there is one thing that I just want to mention, just because it reminds me. When we thought we didn't have a job to go to, we were at home in Maui. And my dad wanted us to stay in Maui. He said, "Oh, you can be mayor. I'll help you become mayor." And knowing him, I'm sure he could. But basically, we decided to go to the community college to ask if there were any jobs. And so they looked at our resume and they said, "Australian National University, is that accredited?" So we decided, no. I think we'll skip this. And so we actually fortunately got to Auckland, and Auckland was superb. I mean, what they did, it was one of those things that can happenstance, because the person who was first interested in us was Michael Sinclair. Pete Sinclair, who was the doyen of New Zealand history. But the reason he wanted us because he had read my history of Johor, and he was interested in the British Empire, and he liked it, so he invited us over. And then we met Nicholas Stein, and that made a tremendous difference because of Nick's considerable talents, both as a scholar as well as an administrator. As a result of his influence, Southeast Asia studies developed in New Zealand and became a very important part of the curriculum. And it was there that the first Cambridge Issue of Southeast Asia began. In the organization of the first Cambridge history that was published in 1992 under Nicholas Stein's leadership. So it is interesting that now this is a second edition, or not the second edition, but the second Cambridge history of Southeast Asia, a 3-volume work, which is now being edited, general editorship of Barbara, and Miriam and I are both volume editors. And so this has come full circle in a way as a result of our time in New Zealand. And so it is from New Zealand that we then had an opportunity, and this was an important opportunity as well, which I'd like to mention, which was we were invited by Japan, by the Center for Southeast Asian Studies in Tokyo, to come in. And the reason they accepted me and Baba, as they also accepted Michael on twin at the same time, because this was supposed to be for Southeast Asians, and they said, well, you're really Southeast Asians. And so they brought us in. And the Japanese were wonderful. And one of the things that we realized when we were there was there's so much interest in Southeast Asia, in Japan, or even just in Indonesia. They said, if they published a work in Japanese on Indonesia, they wouldn't have any problem selling. There was a huge audience out there. And then we realized after a while that there was a lot of things which the Japanese were doing, which we knew very little about. We had abstracts, they were kind enough to publish abstracts, but their scholarship was very, very good. And one of the ways that we thought was a model was the fact that their Centers for Southeast Asian Studies were based on teamwork. And so what you had is a group of scientists working with social scientists, working with geographers, so that you had a team of scholars who worked on one project. It's very Japanese, very teamwork, and they would go together to the field, do the proper research, and then write up their findings. And so what we found so valuable was that they were interested in things that our centers were not. We weren't looking at agronomy, for example, or the relationship of the landscape to documents or whatever. They were using the whole scheme of things. And so one of the things that I learned from the teamwork feature that they were doing is that this is something that I could also do in my future research, because what I realized is that I was becoming very interested in water and the role of water in history. But how to go about doing this was always problematic. But if you took the approach that the Japanese did, and one of the teams in the University of Montana did exactly that. What they did was they took scientists as well as social scientists and others, a whole team of people to work on one gravel bed river in Montana. And it was one of the most successful pieces of description of a river that I've ever seen. And it's made me realize that if we really want to do better in the kind of histories that we write, if we're going to be looking at environment, for example, which is the new direction that I'm going into on water, we need to have far more input from other parts of the university. And this is where the University of Hawaii is very well suited for that. We do have the kind of scholars that will make it possible. So finally, I just want to mention that where do we go from here? So when Bob ended, you had a sense that in America, it was a real struggle to maintain Southeast Asian history. And one of the things that I wanted to mention was our time in Singapore, modern Singapore. And one of the things that was very impressive to us was what Singapore has done. So that we were in Singapore for two periods where we worked at the National University of Singapore. And we were very impressed with the commitment of the faculty and the students and the manner in which they have become probably one of the best universities in Asia. But we were also research fellows at the Yusuf Ishak Institute for Southeast Asian Studies. And this is still there. It is a think tank, but what it does, it's an organization which tries to help the Southeast Asians talk to each other as well as with foreign scholars to work on some of the main problems within Southeast Asia. But one of the things they had there while we were there was also some impact on history as well as in underwater archaeology. And so one of the things I think might be valuable is to try to convince ISIS, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, to also encourage again more of historical studies so that the people from the region can contribute far more to each other, because they are, as Barbara was pointing out, the region's interested in their own histories and identities. They want histories. And one of the value things that I've learned by reading stuff from these areas is that oftentimes the things that are written by students from that area focus on different types of documents. Documents that Westerners oftentimes overlook or don't know about. And so this is the kind of contribution they can have. And this became very clear to me when I had some students from Jakarta who were working in Islam, working at Islamic Institute. And one of the things that they did was to write about the coming of Islam or the importance of Islam. But the kind of sources they used and how they use them were different from the way that Westerners approach the very same subject. So what I'm suggesting here now, just to end right now, is that I think the future of Southeast Asian history, particularly, will be within the region itself, because there's still a very strong interest in the past. And if ISIS or an institution like that would be the vehicle for the exchange of ideas, I think then the history of Southeast Asia, including early modern Southeast Asia, would be saved. Thank you.
So now we have some time for Q&A, both from this audience and if I can work with my very smart GAs, perhaps also with the virtual audience. But let's start with questions from the 3D world here, for either or both of the insights.
I can start off as a colleague, longtime colleague of Barbara in Asian Studies, and my husband was a dear colleague of Leonard's in history. So thank you for the wonderful stories of the trajectories, how you got to where you are in many ways. I wonder if you'd like to each of you share your particular experiences, you in history at UH and you in Asian Studies here at UH. How you see the particular departments or programs re-envisioning themselves and changing themselves as you also changed, but as more particularly as each individual program at UH also morphed, mutated, and changed over the years that you've been here.
Thank you. But I think Asian Studies has, first of all, changed the program, I think. That's lower status, but it's now, for the last several 2 or 3 years, it's been a department. That makes a difference. I think one of the major impediments, of course, we have lots of ideas, and you know, we're just looking now for an environmental humanities person. But you could have lots of good ideas, but if the positions aren't there, it's very, very difficult for people to change and alter. I think we have become less siloed, have Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Southeast Asian, but I think interaction between the different groups is better than it was before. It used to be very difficult for students to take a course in, to be a China specialist and then take a course in Southeast Asia. That used to be quite hard, but now it's easy. So I think interaction across the, between the fields is definitely improved. I think well, there's a tremendous, there's a response to student demand. That's one of the major issues. And students are now, for the most part, interested in recent events. So even though we might see, you know, in an interdisciplinary department, there are some courses on literature might be useful or interesting. Whether students would actually sign up is a big, you invest a lot when you put a job ad out. There's a lot invested in it. And you also have to be very sure that you're going to have some good applicants. So there's those kinds of constraints that I think really, for any department, not just Asian studies, for any department can limit the scope of innovation. Not stop it, but still. But I think the Asian Studies department over the last 30 years, I think now, I think Rick was chair for a very long time. I think you agree with me, probably Rick, and you, Mimi too. You know, it's evolved. It's become, I think, and presently we've been under the chairmanship of Professor Clayton, and I must say, with Dr. Spurs, great support. Thank you so much. We've been quite successful in getting quite considerable grants, and I think that's really significant. Shows the importance. I think the relationship with the other centres, with Centre for Southeast Asian Studies and the Centre for Japanese Studies, it's good, it's flourishing. But you know, maybe other people can chime in too.
Let's hear from Leonard. The
Well,
question
I'm sorry, since maybe I didn't kind clear, but thank you. That's a way in which the department has developed. But I was also thinking, in so many years, 3 decades, the trajectory of the field has changed, and in so many departments, the trajectory of what they thought, you know, what Asian studies used to consider itself to be and what it didn't consider, and how the questions and the issues and the ideas about what constitutes, in your case, history, has changed since you've been there.
Yes, well, in history, I think there has been a change. We've actually moved more toward trying to look at a field, for example, environmental history, and then decide that if we want an environmental historian, which area would you like that person to have a specialization in or whatever. But so what is happening, I think, Vina, maybe you could also help me here. So what is happening is that it's more going toward fields that the history department understands will be of interest to the students. That the area studies that was developed by Danny Park when he was head is no longer, we're not dividing the department as we were before under Asian fields. And so that is one of the major things. Vina, do you want to say anything more? No. Okay, so basically that's what is going on at the moment. And of course, now with the universities move away from Asia and so forth, there is an attempt to try to see how we can pivot toward Asia again by creating a sense of the value of what we can offer to the university. So this is still in the planning stages.
Thanks. First I need to ask you, and then Steve, and then Tim Barnard.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, just like our first speaker, Dr. Andaya, I also have a little bit of experience teaching higher sometimes looking out at the students, I wonder, who of them are gonna be future landlords, my field specifically China history. But, I wonder when you think about, who these future students might be, what, in your research, do you hope will inspire those future students? What do you hope are maybe the biggest 2 or 3 things that they'll take away from what you contributed to the field?
Are you talking about the students generally or high school? Or school students?
Yeah, I guess so I meant like high school students who will then go on into undergraduate and graduate school studying specifically Southeast Asia.
Well, one of the, I know most about Australia, obviously, but one of the big things that wasn't there when I was a teacher is mobility. There's so many programs now where students can go out to Asia, stay with a family, come back, with a little language and inspired, but that's also carries over into the college years too. Here in the United States, I've had so many students who wanted to study the area because they had a semester abroad at some point. So I think that's a huge assistance. Of course, it still costs, and lots of people can't afford it. It's not necessarily open to everybody, but I think that's one of the, to make people feel that this is a real part of the world. It's not just something in a book. When I was 15 years old and I studied geography, we sat in the class with our book like this in front of us, and the teacher said, underline, 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 underline. We went through like that, and we had to learn the passages, underline. So, and when I started as a graduate student, it was just chalk and talk, no PowerPoint. We never had any pictures or anything like that. Because I had no image in my mind. So I think the capacity for learning and bringing a region alive today, videos, travel, and so on, it's like light years away from what it was before. And I think that's what inspires people, is the lived experience, if you can make it happen.
There's so many questions coming online. Steve.
Yeah, I'd like to, this is a little bit of reminiscence, but we were together at the time, and especially after the Vietnam War, when we were all bombarded with Southeast Asia. Does that make any sense? No? Was that invented by the British Southeast Asia Command in World War II? Did it exist before? Is there any there? No, it's there. It doesn't exist. Or is it just a convenience you mentioned? I want to bring you back to something else you mentioned that was very important. You started getting interested in gender studies, particularly where the role of women. Now, my specialty is Vietnam, and it's a little bit different from the other countries. Southeast Asia, it's so severe. So people often say, well, where's Vietnam? Well, it's not anywhere like Thailand and Burma. Yes, because the role of women, the lives of women, 12 the area, from one end to another, very, very simple. I always told my students, you go to a market in Vietnam, or you go to a market in Burma, you go to a market in Malaysia. Who is running the market? On the household economy, they manage the money. It's women buying from women, selling to women. And if you don't think the household economy is where it's at in Southeast Asia, man. So I think part of you on the right track.
I'm sorry, I need to cut in, but their former students are asking questions online, and I think we need to let their former students ask some questions too. First, from Tim Barnard at NUS, how has your time at UH influenced your perspectives and approaches to Southeast Asia? Short answer, there's 4 questions. So how has your time here influenced how you look at Southeast Asia?
I think what is very, very quickly, I think one of the big difference in meaning, I stopped being historian in the classroom. Almost, right, Lucy? Have I stopped being historian almost? That I'm working, I teach about contemporary Southeast Asia. That's been remarkable, you know, it's been a voyage of discovery for me in many ways because, yeah, so that's how I approach.
Yes, for me, I found teaching in Hawaii very easy, mainly because they reminded me so much of the students that I knew before, but also they're very Southeast Asian, right? I mean, they don't come up and tell you, there's a difference in, I can say, there's a difference between mainland students and Hawaii students, right? And so this is something that I found very easy to adapt.
From Muhammad Ali, this is a quote, Leonard and Barbara student, 2002 to 2007, now at University of California, Riverside. Questions to both Andaya. How would you convince local students and scholars to do research about other localities and nations beyond their ethnic or national backgrounds? And how would you convince people in the region about Southeast Asia as a coherent region, as a field of study worth advancing? What would be your one piece of advice to Southeast Asians working on Southeast Asia? One piece.
I think curiosity. You have to be curious about what's happening elsewhere.
Yes, I think what I had suggested earlier about the role of ISIS Institute might be the way to go. Because what ISIS is doing is bringing in scholars from the different countries and getting them together, talking to each other. I think that's probably a good way.
One of the major Ford Foundation had a 10-year project that Ford Foundation based on. And it was to bring, to do exactly what I'm talking about, to encourage people in Southeast Asia to work on other parts of Southeast Asia. What they found was the major problem was language. So people could do a dance, or they could do an art, or they could do a non-verbal topics. But it was very, very difficult. It wasn't a long enough period of study. It just reminded them language acquisition takes a long time. For Southeast Asians as much as for Westerners.
I don't know if, please forgive me for mispronouncing your name, Ruchi Pototanon, do you know? Thanks for sharing your experience. I just want to ask, are there research topics you had to abandon due to certain circumstances? As a young scholar myself, it is sometimes too difficult to let go or to shelve research ideas when there are more urgent things to be done. That you would have to abandon topics.
Well, I abandoned the topic because it's too hard.
Oh,
So I was trying to write how the societies in Eastern Indonesia, how did they operate together successfully without an overarching political unity? And so I was tracing these kinds of systems, but that is difficult. And so if you have a number of people doing it together, it might be.
But I wanted to write just a single sole authored monograph on religion in Southeast Asia. And it's probably this quote just up to 1900 times, 1400 to 1900. And it's done on, but other things got in the way. And I don't think I'm going to live long enough to finish all of it. But that's my opinion. But I'm sitting very.
Let me ask a question. So I know this is about the past, but I'm going to ask about the future. And I know that you're not really retiring. And aside from the volume on early modern Southeast Asia, what do you still have other projects that you want to work on? That's my number one, my first question. The second question is, so it's, it's really going to be a big loss for the Soviet to retire, especially for Southeast Asian history here at UH. And as we all know, it's going to be very hard to replace its positions. And I feel like I'm probably the only one who's gonna be the Southeast Asian historian right now. So what do you feel about the future of Southeast Asian history? You know, both as a region or as Leonard was saying, even our department, we have to pivot to more thematic history now because area studies, you know, as we talked about, it has a really robust history, but it's also really under attack, right, in terms of positions, etc. So I just wanted to hear what you are going to say about the future, both your personal and your field.
Well, the easy question is, do we have any other projects? I have, I'm in brief contact with Cornell, with Cambridge for a history of gender and sexuality in Southeast Asia, dinosaurs. Now we do it. And now third edition is you can look it up and it says quite clearly in the acknowledgements, this is our last word, we are never going to do another edition. It says that in black and white, and we have just signed copy. That is the most very species. So that's a future.
Effendi, what's your student?
Yes.
Sorry, so many students. Okay, Effendi, you're from Singapore NUS, Department of Southeast Asian Studies. My question. How do attempts to write national histories in Singapore and Malaysia create challenges when they focus on narratives that favor the ruling party, a specific ethnic group, or a particular period in history, neglecting the experiences of other groups and events?
Yes, it's one of the things that, it is possible to write, of course. I mean, you can go ahead, nowadays, it is possible to use the context through the internet. Groups whose histories have been written out and try to write a history that can stand alone, to challenge really the standard history of the state. I think this is possible. So I think what you need to do then is to decide, what is it that you're going to be focusing on when you write the alternate history of Singapore, for example. Which group are you going to focus on?
But I think, particularly in the case of Malaysia, I think it's a very real question. Can you write a history of the past and ignore ethnic difference? I think it's almost impossible. But I think if we brought if we made any contribution to the field of Malaysian history, not Singapore, but Malaysia, I think because we're outsiders, we had no vested interest in promoting the interests of one group or defending the interests of one group or the other. I think we were seen as fairly even-handed. And I think that's the best that a historian can do with a sensitive subject, to be seen as a person of integrity and who looks at the evidence and tries to think about what it means. But unfortunately, history has become politicized, not only in Malaysia but here as well. And when history becomes politicized, I think that's the danger.
Two more questions. I have to apologize to Michael Santaella that I don't think we're going to get to this person. And Charles, we have a couple of more questions in the room. I feel I need to respect. A student, there's so many. Okay, you're first.
Thank you, Prof. My question is about, again, the future, because we talked about how the future of Southeast Asian history seems to be in the region. But given that the ambivalence, and even if you talk about Singapore, I'm from Singapore, you talk about it being like the knowledge and the history being produced in the region. Each country has its own vested interests. Do you then see Southeast Asian history going forward as becoming more fractured and not so much regional and coherent as a whole, but you see it more breaking up into individual, and even within countries themselves, producing
local histories, do you see that as a possible direction which Southeast Asian history would pursue?
I think it is already. But one of the things that struck me when I was in Singapore was the fact that many of the scholars who come to Singapore have English. So English is a very strong second language in Southeast Asia. And so this is going to be the language by which they communicate with each other. But I like the fact that these countries are approaching their histories in a specific way. So it may be that any general history now will have to be a history of the different countries and the interests of the different countries. So the different countries, it's not the kind of history that we tend to write, which is trying to make everything mesh and form a unit. It may be just, this is the history of the region.
Or perhaps just a topic, just one, trying to break it down into one topic now. That's built across the region rather than narrow, but
Two more questions, we'll have to close. Okay, so you'll get one and then Jeff will close it. Yes.
So you mentioned about how your travels and your affiliation with different institutions shape your scholarship through the years. But do you think, how much freedom do you think that you also carve out for yourselves, or for how much freedom can scholars carve out for themselves when it comes to studying their own interests in relation to certain institutions that fund, for example, we usually affiliate themselves?
What did you, last part? Sorry.
Like how much freedom as scholars can we carve out for themselves in relation with the networks and institutions which fund or, you know, sponsors.
Yeah. I think in my case, it's very clear. I know exactly where I stand. And why it's possible because where I stand is so nobody else stands there. It's very early history. And most people are not that interested. And so it makes it easier. Now, I can say, yes, you know, you don't like the Makassaris, but in this period, you know, and so you can probably do that. And I think that in a sense gives us a certain advantage, which is unfair, because not many people can write from that early perspective. And you know, we get grant permission to do research because who cares what happens? And so we can do practically anything. And so it's a very hard one. I mean, it's easy for us, but I'm not sure it would be as easy for someone working on Islam in the 20th century.
No comment?
Oh. No, a friend of ours once said, that I said, he worked in entirely different fields than at night. He worked in the 17th century and I worked in the 18th century. So, I don't believe I said, but anyway, she said, but in a sense, the same thing happens. But I do think that if you accept a grant, and if there are conditions, or if you feel there are conditions, then it's on your shoulders, you know, you have to bear the consequences or shape yourself to fit whatever they want. You know? And we've been fortunate, we haven't had those restrictions, but for people working, it is a very real consideration. What are the ethics of grant applications? Do you actually slide around the topics you're going to do to make it get through the authorities? Is that right? Is that fair? So I think it's not a problem we've had to face. I don't know the answer, but it is a real problem, I think, for people working on sensitive subjects. In the contemporary period.
All right, sorry that we have to cut it short, but Jeff will be the last.
No, I don't want to be the last. You know, I spent my career basically looking at landscapes in Southeast Asia and how things have changed. And, you know, 1950s, not in this story. And bringing together political and social science, I mean, well, physical and social science, take a look at it. Your point about bringing historians, I think, is fascinating. mean, politically, apology has done something. That history in our work. But it's not really been well addressed, I'd really like to see that. And I totally agree with you, Dan, on your comments about the future of this fall stage. I don't think it's gonna be a real history, but I don't know history department in Southeast Asian University, but are they gonna work with, you know, the other social sciences and biophysical science to develop around?
I think you have to have a university like Hawaii, where you do have these people around.
Yeah.
You can call them, if you can understand what you're saying. I had a question on ENSA, and I sent it to. So, that's. Yeah, so it's where the session is pentax graphics, and I couldn't understand a single thing. So, yeah, so, you know, we've got to communicate, but the scholarship is here, the expertise is here.
So why? What you're saying is gotta be done.
Right, in Southeast Asia, it's gonna be different. That's why I like the way that the Japanese have done. You know, maybe we can learn to do a lot more the Japanese have done. And as I pointed out, it's study by Montana of the gravel bed river system is superb. And if more people could do that, if we can get somebody to give you the funding to bring all these scholars together to work on one project, yeah, that would be ideal.
On that upbeat note, I've been instructed, to close this down. It's been a real privilege and it's not over. You can have some photo ops up here, but I believe we have food. We have food as well, so please stay and eat. All right, thanks everyone. Yeah, got it. Okay, but now there's, yeah, we're supposed to be. No. I'll give it after that.